A drunk heckler challenged Michael Jackson on stage, but what happened in the next 10 minutes became part of world history. The music stopped. 50,000 people fell silent. And the king of pop did something that no one saw coming, something that would define not just that night, but the very essence of who Michael Jackson was as a human being. This isn't just another concert story. This is about the moment when the world's biggest superstar chose humanity over showmanship, when protocol was shattered for the sake of a broken soul, and when a single act of compassion in Madison Square Garden reminded everyone watching that behind the glittering glove and moonwalk was a man who understood pain better than anyone. But before we get to that life-changing moment, let me take you back to how it all began. Because what happened that night in 1988 didn't start with the confrontation, it started hours earlier, with a man who had lost everything and a superstar who was about to discover that sometimes the most important performance isn't the one you planned. It was November 23, 1988. Madison Square Garden was electric with anticipation. Michael Jackson was at the peak of his bad tour, selling out the most prestigious venue in America for 7 consecutive nights. Backstage, everything was running like clockwork. Costume changes timed to the second, lighting cues rehearsed 1,000 times, security protocols designed to handle the screaming masses of fans who would do anything for just a glimpse of their idol. Michael stood in his dressing room, adjusting his iconic sequined glove, running through the setlist one final time. At 30 years old, he had already conquered the world. Thriller had broken every record imaginable. His face was on magazine covers in countries he'd never visited. Children in remote villages sang Billie Jean without knowing a word of English. But success at this level came with a price. The constant scrutiny, the isolation, the pressure to be perfect every single night for fans who saved for months just to see him perform. Michael understood this responsibility deeply. He knew that for many people in that audience, this would be the highlight of their year, maybe their lifetime. What he didn't know was that somewhere in the crowd sat a man named Robert Chen, clutching a ticket that had cost him his last $200. Robert had been a construction worker until a workplace accident 6 months earlier left him with a chronic back injury and no job. His wife had left him 3 weeks ago, taking their daughter with her. The divorce papers were sitting on his kitchen table, and signed, next to empty bottles that had become his only companions. Robert hadn't come to the concert as a fan. He'd come because he was angry at a world where someone could make millions dancing and singing while good, hard-working people like him lost everything. He'd been drinking since the afternoon, building up the courage for something he couldn't quite articulate, something that felt like it might give meaning to his pain. As Michael Jackson stepped onto that stage, neither man knew they were about to change each other's lives forever. The concert began like every other show on the bad tour. The lights dimmed, the crowd erupted, and Michael emerged in a burst of smoke and strobing lights, immediately launching into "Wanna Be Startin' Something." His energy was infectious, his precision flawless. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. Michael moved through his greatest hits with the kind of effortless mastery that only comes from countless hours of rehearsal. The moonwalk that defied gravity, the spin that seemed to last forever, the way he could make 20,000 people feel like he was singing directly to each one of them. This was Michael Jackson at his absolute peak, not just as a performer, but as a force of nature. Meanwhile, Robert Chen was getting more agitated by the minute. Every cheer from the crowd, every perfectly executed dance move, every moment of joy around him only amplified his bitterness. Here was this man who seemingly had everything, talent, fame, wealth, adoration, while Robert had lost it all through no fault of his own. During "Beat It," something inside Robert snapped. He stumbled to his feet, pushed past the security guards who were focused on the stage, and somehow made it over the barrier. Before anyone could stop him, he was on stage, shouting words that were lost in the thunderous music but whose meaning was clear in his body language. This was a challenge, a confrontation born from desperation and pain. The backup dancers froze. The band kept playing for a few more bars, unsure of what to do. Security rushed toward the stage. But then something unprecedented happened. Michael Jackson raised his hand, the one wearing the famous glove, and everything stopped. The music cut off mid-note. The dancers stepped back. Even the security guards hesitated. In that moment of absolute silence, with 50,000 people holding their breath, Michael did the one thing no one expected. He walked over to Robert Chen, looked into his eyes, and asked, "What's wrong?" The arena was so quiet you could hear the echo of Michael's voice reaching the furthest seats. What happened next would be talked about for decades. Robert, swaying slightly from the alcohol, tried to speak but couldn't form coherent words. The pain, the anger, the desperation, it all came pouring out in a broken stream of consciousness. He talked about his accident, his wife, his daughter who wouldn't speak to him, the bills he couldn't pay, the life that had crumbled around him while people like Michael lived in luxury. The crowd didn't know what to make of it. Some booed, angry that their concert was being interrupted. Others watched in fascination. Security stood ready to intervene at Michael's signal. But Michael just listened, really listened, as if this broken man's story was the most important thing in the world. When Robert finally stopped talking, his shoulders shaking with exhaustion and emotion, Michael reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a white handkerchief, not a prop, just a simple piece of cloth he always carried. Without saying a word, he handed it to Robert, who used it to wipe tears he didn't even realize had started flowing. Then Michael did something that nobody, not his band, not his crew, not the arena management, was prepared for. He sat down on the stage. Right there, in front of 50,000 people, the king of pop sat cross-legged on the floor and gestured for Robert to sit beside him. The two men sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. Then Michael began to speak, his voice soft but somehow carrying to every corner of the arena. "I know you're hurting," he said. "I can see it in your eyes. And I want you to know that your pain matters. You matter. I don't know what you've been through, but I know what it feels like to feel alone, even when you're surrounded by thousands of people." The crowd was completely silent now, mesmerized by this intimate moment playing out on the world's biggest stage. Michael continued, "Music is supposed to heal. It's supposed to bring us together. And if my music, if this moment, can remind you that you're not alone, then this is the most important show I'll ever do." He stood up and offered his hand to Robert, who took it and rose unsteadily to his feet. Michael walked him to his microphone stand and said, "I want you to stay up here with me. Can you do that?" Robert nodded, still clutching the white handkerchief. Michael turned to his band and said simply, "Man in the Mirror. Subscribe now and leave a comment, because what's about to happen next is the most incredible part of this story." As the opening piano notes of Man in the Mirror began to play, Michael positioned himself at the microphone with Robert standing beside him. But instead of singing the first verse himself, he held the microphone toward Robert and said, "This one's for you." Robert looked terrified, but Michael placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and nodded encouragingly. In a voice that was shaky but somehow pure, Robert began to sing the words that he'd heard on the radio 100 times but had never really listened to until that moment. "I'm gonna make a change, for once in my life." His voice cracked on the high notes, he forgot some of the words, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time in months, Robert Chen wasn't thinking about his failures, his pain, or his losses. He was singing about hope, about change, about the possibility that tomorrow could be different from today. Michael joined in on the chorus, and gradually, incredibly, the entire audience began to sing along. 50,000 voices united in a song about transformation, about taking responsibility for making the world, and your own life, better. The sound was overwhelming, transcendent, like nothing anyone in that arena had ever experienced. When the song ended, the applause wasn't the usual enthusiastic cheering of a concert crowd. It was deeper, more profound, the kind of applause that happens when people have witnessed something truly meaningful. Michael embraced Robert, whispered something in his ear that only he could hear, and then called for security, not to remove Robert, but to escort him safely back to his seat. But the evening wasn't over. Before Robert left the stage, Michael took off his famous sequined glove and pressed it into Robert's hands. "Keep this," he said. And when you look at it, remember that you have the power to change your story. But here's the incredible part that nobody expected, the part that shows who Michael Jackson really was beneath all the fame and spectacle. After the concert ended and the arena emptied, Michael didn't head to his hotel suite or the after-party. Instead, he found Robert Chen, who was sitting alone in a corner of the venue, still holding the glove like it was made of precious metal. Michael sat down beside him, no cameras, no reporters, no audience, and they talked for 2 hours. Really talked. About pain, about loss, about the pressure of expectations and the weight of disappointment. Michael shared things about his own struggles that he'd never spoken about publicly, the loneliness of fame, the difficulty of maintaining relationships when your life belonged to the world, the fear that people loved the image more than the man. Robert told Michael about his daughter Emma, how she used to dance to "Beat It" in their living room, how he hadn't spoken to her in weeks because he was too ashamed of what he'd become. Michael listened without judgment, without trying to fix everything, just offering the presence of another human being who understood what it meant to carry pain. Before they parted ways, Michael wrote his personal phone number on a piece of paper and gave it to Robert. "If you ever need to talk," he said, "call me. Not my people, not my management. Me." 3 months later, Robert Chen checked himself into rehab. He used his one phone call not to contact his estranged wife, but to call Michael and tell him he was ready to make that change he'd sung about. Michael flew to California to visit him twice during his 90-day program. Robert got clean, found a new job, and slowly began rebuilding his relationship with his daughter. He never sold Michael's glove, never spoke to the tabloids about their private conversations, never tried to capitalize on that night at Madison Square Garden. He kept it as a reminder of the moment when a superstar chose compassion over protocol and reminded him that no matter how far you've fallen, you always have the power to choose differently. The white handkerchief that Michael gave him that night became a symbol in Robert's recovery. He carried it with him to every job interview, every difficult conversation with his ex-wife, every moment when he felt like giving up. And when his daughter Emma graduated from high school 10 years later, Robert gave that handkerchief to her, along with the story of the night when Michael Jackson reminded him that everyone deserves a second chance. For Michael, that night at Madison Square Garden became a defining moment in how he approached his career and his life. He began incorporating more opportunities for spontaneous human connection into his performances. He started programs to help struggling families, funded rehab centers, and always made time for people who were going through difficult situations. When reporters asked him about the incident, Michael was characteristically humble. "That night reminded me why I do what I do," he said. "It's not about the dancing or the singing or the fame. It's about using whatever platform you have to remind people that they matter, that they're not alone, and that there's always hope for a new beginning." The ripple effects of that 10-minute moment continued long after both men left this world. The story became part of Michael Jackson's legend, not because of his talent or his record sales, but because of his humanity. It inspired other artists to break protocol when they encountered people in need, reminded audiences that performers are human beings too, and demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply acknowledge another person's pain. Years later, when Emma Chen became a social worker, she would tell her clients about the night when the king of pop taught her father that everyone has the power to make a change, for once in their life. She kept Michael's glove in a frame in her office, not as a piece of memorabilia, but as a reminder that small acts of compassion can change the trajectory of a human life. The white handkerchief that started as a simple gesture of kindness became a symbol of hope passed down through generations. When Emma's own children face difficult moments, she tells them about their grandfather and the pop star who showed the world that true greatness isn't measured by how high you can rise, but by how willing you are to reach down and lift others up with you. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009, but the lesson from that night in Madison Square Garden lives on. It reminds us that in a world that often feels divided by fame and fortune, status and circumstance, the most powerful force is still the simple recognition of our shared humanity. Share this story and subscribe if you believe in the power of compassion to change lives. Because the truth is, we all have the ability to be someone's Michael Jackson moment, to stop what we're doing, look another person in the eye, and remind them that they matter. In the end, that's the real legacy of the king of pop, not the records he broke or the dances he invented, but the reminder that true greatness comes from using whatever gifts you have to make others feel less alone in the world. And sometimes, that's as simple as offering someone a handkerchief and treating their pain as if it's the most important thing in the universe. That's the moment that stunned the world, not because of what it said about Michael Jackson's talent, but because of what it revealed about his heart.